Tonight we shine a light on civic power. For 10 years, the Organization for Responsible Governance, better known as ORG, has been quietly but powerfully equipping citizens, advocating for transparency and driving meaningful reform. From the fight for full implementation of the Freedom of Information Act to launching tools that connect non-profits and educate citizens about the national budget, ORG has made one thing clear: knowledge is power and participation is progress. So tonight, we speak with the people helping to shape a more informed, engaged, and responsible Bahamas. You're watching On the Record. Our show begins on the other side of this break. This is On the Record. In our first segment, we are joined by a familiar face to On the Record, to this desk, ORG's Executive Director, Matt Aubry. From launching civic tools like the Freedom of Information Act Resource Hub and the Map for Good to celebrating 10 years of reform advocacy, Matt will walk us through the mission, the milestones, and of course, what's next for ORG. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Thank
you are
so
definitely a regular here.
It's a great program. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having us.
And thank you for always answering our call. So you're celebrating a decade of advocacy. It does not feel that long.
Depends on the day.
Yeah, I'm sure. I remember when you first started, and there was a lot of skepticism about what you would do, whether it was a political organization, what this would mean for the country. But let's first of all talk about what are you most proud of in these 10 years?
It's interesting because when we started 10 years ago, it was a volunteer group that had really come out of that first push to make sure that when government put a VAT together, that it was done with the right amount of research and that it reflected the interests of the Bahamian people. And once that was done, then there was this interest that things like freedom of information and fiscal responsibility, which would make sure that the VAT monies went to where they were supposed to be, were necessary. And so that's how we were formed, to really push forward on these pieces of policy.
Something good did come out of that, huh?
Yes. So we did have that. However, it was also the group that formed us was Bahamian business folks who had achieved a certain level of success and also wanted to make sure that the conditions around that they saw eroding don't fall so far away. So we have economic challenges like Barbados or Jamaica, or needed a bailout, those types of things. But it was really just me. And so over the 10 years, what we've done is really push to make sure that ORG is much more reflective of Bahamian society. The folks that I have the pleasure of working with now are these young, talented, bright, dynamic Bahamians who are pushing the envelope and setting the vision and pushing us into the areas that are critical. We started really working on policy, and now we work in 4 different specific areas. We still are out there benchmarking laws. Last year we benchmarked and put out information on the Ombudsman law, or this year earlier the Independent Commission of Investigations, or the disclosures law that was put forward. We made sure that was reflective of benchmarking against standards and also had the input of our communities. But we realized that laws like that, and we'll talk about freedom of information in a bit, don't mean a lot unless there's an active citizenry pushing to make sure that they achieve what they were originally intended to have happen. So we pushed now into civic engagement, and we spend a lot of our time in the community now. And that's one of the biggest, I think, most important things that we're working on, which is helping Bahamians to regain that voice. we as an organization aren't strictly an advocacy organization, or we don't necessarily hold the government's feet to the fire as much as try and facilitate this two-way dialogue. And that becomes really important to make sure that the people who have been put in charge are hearing those folks that they're supposed to represent, and that the folks in the community are pushing forward. And that social contract happens when people feel comfortable and that they feel like there's meaningful ways for themselves to get involved. So the fact that we've moved into that space is really, really exciting. And I guess the other side of it is we also are doing a lot of work to help local Bahamian not-for-profit organizations to become more impactful and more sustainable. I've worked in not-for-profits my whole professional life, so over 33 years, and I believe very much in what they can contribute. And there's so much talent in this sector, so we're helping folks to learn how to fundraise and how to do communications and monitor and financially report what they're working on. And so as we see that, all of a sudden you're going to have a much broader base of folks who are going to help to either both complement what government's doing and sometimes counterbalance what government's doing. So those things that we've gone from 10 years on just looking at policies to really seeing tangible work in communities and with groups that are having a direct impact on our public, that's really powerful. You
obviously have been very busy, and your evolution is very interesting to me, having been created to be the watchdogs on a specific thing or help people to understand what was happening with a specific thing, but now having evolved into so much more. But let me ask you, I mean, from where you sit, the fact that you are a bit of, a watchdog organization, do you get the kind of respect, and I mean that, in a very basic way, from governmental organizations? Mm-hmm. Do people listen? Do people provide you with the information that you need? Do they recognize who you are? Do they acknowledge the work that you do?
There's a yes and a no to that answer. I think we get acknowledged often, particularly the information that we've put forward from laws. Over 40 different pieces of legislation are reflective of comments and feedback and recommendations we've put forward, or it's been referenced in the debate on those laws. We on a regular basis get feedback coming back from the community. When you get into government, though, there's the elected officials, and then there's those folks that actually are working in the public service. And we have a lot of direct connection and feedback there. I and my team of 4 other folks are on probably at this point about 6 different government task force committees or working groups. And so there's a recognition of what we can bring to the table and a partnership that has existed throughout that 10 years. So it's important to understand that people do see the relevance of what we're working on, and they utilize the professional folks.
But do they listen?
So listening is a really important topic, and I think it's one of the things we learned out of our civic engagement work. Too often we come in and say, here's a solution, and then we try and convince folks, this is the solution, go ahead and do that because it makes sense, or it's it'll help out, or it's what our agenda is, or whatever. So as we started to go into communities, and not just here in Nassau, but across the Family Islands, we really adopted a different perspective. And the first thing we do is listen. And the second thing we do is then try and educate and then move towards action. And so that listening, I think we get a lot of folks who are listening to what we're talking about, a lot of folks who acknowledge what we're saying has merit, makes a lot of sense. The opportunities that we bring forward are rarely against one government or another, but much more how we've seen these problems happen over and over again.
What makes sense?
This is a pathway forward, and what could we do to do that? And that acknowledgement is pretty universal across the board. It's moving to action that I think is challenging, and a lot of that falls to maybe almost a disbelief that things can change from where they've been.
And it's interesting you brought that up, because that was going to be my next question. People are listening, but are they acting? And do you see any results from the action? And
action becomes that key word to think about, because we all know, let's go back to say beginning of the year, we all know we just spent a good month eating everything we could that we know is bad for us. And we all know we should all go back to the gym, and maybe that first week in January we do, and then we stop. Mm-hmm. We all know you just got some accreditation on some of your work, bringing education about colonoscopies and taking care of your body. We all know that. That's not like we don't understand that. We know we shouldn't be going online at Wendy's every other day to have those wonderfully tasty, terrible foods that don't help us. And yet action becomes the next step. So we know that that's not simply we're going to share the information, we're going to tell you what to do, and you need to act. where the Bahamas is now has not just manifested the way. It's happened over a long time, from before independence to now. And so moving people to action and change is one of the most difficult things, and it requires patience, it requires persistence. It requires a common thread and understanding that this is going to benefit us across different bounds. So movement is going to be expected to go slow, and org has always been about that slow but progressive forward movement. We're here 10 years, we may be here another 10 years, but we do see indicators that, yes, people are moving towards action, and that's because they can reference and say, hey, when we need a new policy to be understood, let's talk to org, let's go to the website,
and,
let's do that.
You talk about the first 10 years, and I think, your presence now more than ever is needed. And I think you've established yourself as that go-to. This next question, it pains me to even ask it because I have discussed it so many times in this space. You and I have talked about it. I have talked about it with colleagues. I've talked about it with consistent governments. What is the status of the Freedom of Information Act in the Bahamas?
This is talk about relevance. This is a great topic. So Freedom of Information, as folks may remember, was actually originally passed in 2012 by an administration that didn't enact it. The next administration came in and wanted their own version. About 22 different groups that represented about 50,000 folks pushed forward for passage and consultation on the bill. The bill was passed in 2017. As a result, it's 2025, and only 3 parts of the bill have been enacted. The ability to repeal the last act, a whistleblowers component that didn't have a lot of information, and the ability to hire an information commissioner, which is based on best practices, is absolutely necessary to bring it forward. The information commissioner in 2022, thereabouts, put together and developed an implementation plan that would show how we do the internal training with government to be able to utilize and respond to this act, public education, which has to be widespread so that citizens would understand how to use the act and what it's about, and regulations that would be established. It's interesting to know that I just had a conversation with a lot of not-for-profits in the Bahamas, in the Caribbean, about freedom of information. The Bahamas has a public interest test built into its law so that if you were refused information by a government, you can go to the commissioner and he would use a test to determine, is it based on better to release this information in the public's interest or in the government side, and they're supposed to be weighted in the public's interest. Well, that regulations is actually sitting with the attorney generals. The last 2 years, the budget has only indicated about $140,000 for freedom of information, which really only allows that group to continue to function. It doesn't allow for that implementation plan. We're now right before the budget. This is a key time to be able to push forward for the budget and the money to be included, the $1 million to be included in freedom of information, and that the prioritization of the draft going forward. So if you think about a phase of where we are, we've never been closer. So what we've done is we took this upon ourselves in the last number of months to do a bunch of education out in the community. We've gone to 3 different islands beyond Nassau, beyond New Providence rather, and engaged hundreds of folks around this. And we've sat and listened to them in conversation. What do you think about freedom of information? We've been advocating for 10 years, but what do you think? And what we heard across the board is that Bahamians are ready for this to happen. They may not even necessarily call it freedom of information, but they want equality, they want fairness. They want to understand how their monies are being used in their own interest. They want to know how decisions are being made. And freedom of information isn't always just about a gotcha moment. In fact, it's much more about the benefits that it can bring to a community. To understand and believe that the system applies to you means you're probably likely to get involved in that system.
Help me to understand. It's being funded at about $100,000, but it needs about $1 million to really be effective. So that's a $900,000 difference. Any indication that those monies will be allocated, will be increased near to the million? I mean, spend millions of dollars on all kinds of.
Well, so that's the thing. Is $1 million becomes daunting until you understand the scale and the scope of what it can do. An environment that unleashes people's trust in a system that allows you to feel like you can be more aware of how government is using your monies means that a government, and research shows this, is more effective and more efficient. So government savings come with that process. When you make a decision that you know is going to see the light of day, you're going to be a little more conscious about how that's made and a little more deliberate about people understanding all the mechanisms behind it. That comes to part of it. We've heard from the last administration before, that there doesn't seem to be that much of an appetite moving this forward, whether it be because other things are more priority or not. But when we hear in the community, when I go to the grocery store, when I go to the pharmacy, when we're in the family islands and people are talking about this, we want to make sure that we marshal that voice to go directly to government, because that's what can move political will, is public will. So people have talked about being apprehensive to reach out because they either don't want to have anything come back on them or be perceived, or they feel like maybe this isn't gonna happen. But if you listen to talk radio or you look at the WhatsApp chats, lots of feedback is going there. We created a tool, an online tool that's free for folks to use on our website, where they not only can learn all about freedom of information, what it is, what it isn't. It's not always a silver bullet. What the process is and what status it's in, but also a tool that they can use to help them to write a respectful and professional letter that will go directly from them to the folks that they have elected to represent them. So and it can say, if we want freedom of information, this is what we want,
so
why we want it.
So that we're clear, people have the ability through your organization, through the mechanism that you have set up online, to be able to write a letter, a respectful letter, a clear, concise, hey, this is what I want letter to their specific member of parliament or representative.
Yes. And the tool allows you can put information in fields, and it allows you to be able to personalize it, identify why you think this would be important. We send that draft back to you with the contact information for your member of parliament, so you can further personalize that.
Wow.
We also include a lot of tips. We don't want this to be something that's used to spam.
Sure.
We want,
or to attack.
To attack. And so it is up to a person to make a choice, but this tool would allow it easier than ever before to directly reach out and let your member of parliament know what you think.
And why is that important, Matt? Because I've sat here many times and I say to people, it makes no sense for us to sit and complain. We have to take action. That means advocacy. That means doing things. So for the first time, there is a way for you to go through a proper process, as opposed to just sending, a letter that may not be, may not be proper and fitting for you to be sending to your MP. But there is now a mechanism in place to do this. Why is this so important for us to do?
Actually, for both sides. It's important for government to be in the process of hearing directly from constituents, but it's also important for us to reinforce that constituents have a role and a responsibility. And so when folks have given up their potential thought of I can contribute to this discussion, when you all of a sudden do, because you've sent an email and you get a response back, and we're starting to see folks are getting responses back.
So the MPs are responding?
MPs are responding.
Really?
And all of a sudden now you've got this two-way dialogue, which is really the heart of fostering representative democracy. Folks come out in the Bahamas in record numbers, except for the last election, but they do so usually in an emotional way, and usually
we do have high voter turnout.
Right, but it's also a lot of times to throw out the group instead of usher in a new group, and then we don't see a lot of civic engagement in those 5 years. We don't see a lot of outreach from government to the citizenry, but we also don't see the citizenry taking the steps forward.
I think sometimes...
And we need to facilitate that ongoing dialogue, because we're going to get better policies, more effective governance, and more representative decision-making.
So what I like about this tool is often a lot of our leaders are living in or our representatives are living in an echo chamber. And the people around them are telling them things or telling them what they want to hear without the benefit of really hearing from the wider community and hearing from folks on things that are really important to them or that grieve them. And when you're talking about, something like, again, I'm going to harp on freedom of information, you're telling me that we need an estimated $1 million to really bring this thing to proper fruition, but the government's only giving $100,000. I mean, everybody should be in front of their laptops, computers, phones, on your side, writing to their MPs and listen, you all need to find $900,000 to make freedom of information a reality.
And I think it becomes, the model is that clearly when policies are reflective of the input of those folks that are going to be most affected by it, the policies tend to do better. not only just because they've
Right.
reflected the input, but you're getting buy-in and ownership. The IDB did a study 2 years ago that showed that public trust in government was the lowest in the world in the Latin American and Caribbean region. We took it upon ourselves to do some local research to reinforce that. Focus groups around all different islands to sit and talk to folks. And in fact, they reinforced that yes, trust in government is very low. But it's also in all kinds of institutions. It's in not-for-profit, it's in media, it's in corporations, it's in big entities.
There's a trust deficit in the world.
And that's the world we're in right now. So we have to also give people a chance to understand that their interests can be represented if they advocate for it. But we have to be very intentional in creating spaces that are safe and meaningful and that both sides can understand outside of the political agenda. The last two administrations, we've seen these mega wins, and a majority, and the last two administrations have also conscripted most of those MPs from the governing party into cabinet. So the debates in cabinet may be very robust and vibrant and reflective of lots of different things, but because cabinet is confidential, as it should be, no one sees that.
And nobody knows what.
So it reinforces, sit back and see what happens.
We're on the clock now, but I want to talk a little bit about the Map for Good and what that is about. It's something that you've introduced for faith-based and non-for-profit organizations.
So we teach citizens to get involved. We do active citizen work in our community. But then the thought is, what do you do with it? So the tools that we're offering through our website, check us out at orgbahamas.com, offer a lot of those ways to get involved. But often people want to be around other like-minded folks on issues they're concerned about. We have, at last estimate, probably over 1,400 registered not-for-profits in the Bahamas. After COVID, there was a law.
1,400?
Yep. In 2019, after Dorian, there was a law that was passed that set up a new registration process, and over 1,400 organizations have registered, including churches, faith-based organizations, more traditional not-for-profits. But there exists no full register of who these groups are. The Registrar General has not necessarily been able to generate that or produce it. So we're looking around and understanding that there are groups out there that we don't know what they're doing, where they are.
1,400 groups are registered, but we don't know who they are?
Exactly. So we've taken upon ourselves to go out and develop a database and a map that will be publicly available of who these groups are, where they're providing services, where the potential overlap is, and where the
I'm still stuck on we don't know who they are. These people are seemingly collecting funds to be able to help and doing these things, raising funds, etc. And we don't know who they are.
Somebody would know who they are. There's no list, and in the sector,
and that's what I mean. There's no list. There's no public
and
list.
we've in the sector we've done this a few different times. Civil Society Bahamas and we and Guanaluthro organization, a foundation, have all worked collectively in different times. But with this new registration, that means there's new groups in that haven't been accounted for and old groups that have fallen away. COVID was hard on our sector.
Yeah.
But think about in times of disaster. Think about the necessity and what role those small organizations, those churches played.
Let me ring the bell. We're 2 weeks away from the start of the hurricane season.
Well, given the way climate changes and how low those mangoes are all holding, this could be a rough year.
I ate two last night. I just want you to know they already started.
But think about the implications there. Think about our issues related to youth development, fighting crime, gender equity, the work that we need to do in education or addressing the health issues that face our country. We're talking about 1,400 organizations. Many of them are probably small, but they're all in community, and they all can be leveraged to work and complement with what government's doing.
Every so often, I'm worried about things that I hear in this country. But unfortunately, we're out of time. But listen, first of all, I just want to thank you for the great work that you all have been doing. 10 years, it's a significant milestone. The country is better for your existence. I know that many days it seems like you're flying blind or you're on an ever uphill climb, but we thank you. Imagine where we would be without you. So we thank you. We want to encourage you to continue the work, and I want to encourage folks to go and visit what you have set up online and get involved. People always ask, well, what can I do? Get involved. Write a letter. Write your MP. Write a representative. Tell them how you feel. Tell them what you want.
That's our tagline, is get informed and get involved. And we believe that's really the pathway forward.
Matt, thank you so very much. All the best to you.
Thank you, sir.
And listen, Looking forward to another 10 years. I don't know if I'll be here another 10 years. But
I have great confidence in you.
I want to be, when we start doing this show from a family island under a tree somewhere. All right, so Matt, thank you very much. All the best to you.
Thank you, sir.
All right, well, advocacy isn't just about transparency, it's about participation. After the break, we're joined by an org board member, Therese Turner-Jones, to talk about budgets, fiscal literacy, and how understanding where public money goes can empower us all to build a stronger nation. Stay with us. All right. Our next guest is no stranger to the complex relationship between public finance and national development. Therese Turner-Jones is a respected Bahamian economist and a global development leader with decades of experience at institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, and most recently the Caribbean Development Bank. She's led regional efforts in economic policy, fiscal reform, and sustainability. Now serving on the board of ORG, she brings a sharp lens to the importance of fiscal literacy and the power of informed citizen participation. Therese, welcome to On the Record. That's an impressive introduction and resume.
I know. Thank you, Jerome.
You really bring a wealth of experience and knowledge to ORG's board, and welcome to the show. First of all, let's talk about how your work with the IMF, IDB, and CDB have really helped to shape your view on public finance in the Caribbean.
So this region, the Caribbean region, including the Bahamas, is one of the most heavily indebted regions for lots of reasons. Some complicated, some not so complicated. But as you know, we're all small, open economies. We're price takers. We import a lot. Some fixed exchange rates, some floating exchange rates. Climate change, natural disasters have boosted the debt of a lot of countries because just think back to Dorian, many multiples of GDP that cost. A country like Dominica, over 200% of GDP as a result of Irma and Maria. So all of these shocks, these external shocks, whether they be from natural disasters or global disasters like the Great Depression in 2008-9, COVID, the shock of COVID is still very much present in all of the economies in the region. And the revenue base of many countries in the Caribbean are not sufficient to sustain the level of expenditure that we have. So it's always a balancing act not to push that deficit too high. What some countries have done very successfully, including the Bahamas recently, is to introduce a fiscal responsibility legislation, which keeps in law what the deficit should be and what the debt to GDP should be. For small countries in the Caribbean, the rule of thumb is something like 60% of GDP. Think about the Bahamas, ours is coming down, but it's over 80% of GDP, or around 80% of GDP. When I first started working in Jamaica in long time ago, but most recently in 2013 as the general manager for the Caribbean and of IDB, Jamaica had a debt to GDP ratio of almost 150%.
Wow.
Now, it's there. I've never seen anything this dramatic in any country around the world. Jamaica's reform on the debt side and what they've done with their law, as well as some really tight conditions on the budget. The debt to GDP ratio is now close to 65%.
That's incredible.
Remarkable. It's actually unheard of. So that means you're running a primary surplus. That's the amount of resources the government has left over after it's paid all of its bills to reduce the debt, right? So you cannot lower the debt unless you're generating surpluses. So the Bahamas government right now, the primary surplus is approaching 0%, right? So we've not been adding to the total stock of debt because They've been generating surpluses over time, and so our debt is coming down. But the shock of COVID and the past recessions have landed us with a debt to GDP ratio much higher than I think, as an economist, I'm comfortable with. Because what it signifies, as the deficits grow, as the debt to GDP grows, it says to me as a consumer and you as an investor, hold on, more taxes are coming, right? So that tends to be a damper on investment. That's the connection.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you listen to this, people are listening to you, and those of us who are not economists, who didn't do well in economics, are asking, well, why should I care? Why does this matter to me? So help people to understand why these kinds of things are important to our everyday existence.
It matters a lot. Actually, economics and debt and deficits and so on, it's arithmetic. It's really math. If you spend more than you earn, I only earn $100, but guess what? I want to spend $150. Well, that 50 that you didn't have as your earnings, you've borrowed that, right? But when you borrow the 50, you got to pay it back, and that includes interest. So that's what you want to avoid. You want to avoid those interest payments that actually you may, when you first borrowed at $50, the interest rate may be 5%. Over time, depending on what's happening in the country, if we lose our credit rating, if our credit rating gets downgraded, if the economic situation changes, that interest rate could creep up very fast on you. And that happens a lot with people who have credit card debt, for example. And it's one of the things that you watch when you looking at data on consumer behavior. What's happening with credit markets? How are those interest rates starting to affect the consumers? Consumers pull back, they stop spending. What's happening in the US economy right now, where there's a lot of uncertainty around the policies, that's going to start affecting people's behavior. So this is why it's important. Why it's important nationally for the government, for the country, not the government, to have a good credit rating is when you start lowering that credit rating, your borrowers say, uh-oh, what's going on over there? It's now more expensive to borrow. So we may have been paying 4% last year, now we're going to be paying 5%. And that hurts not just the government, and we've got to pay it back because we're the taxpayers who they're relying on to help them pay the debt back, but it also affects private sector borrowers. Because a sovereign rating of a country doesn't just affect the sovereign, it affects everybody operating in the economy. And so that's why looking at financial markets and financial market information is important, because you can pick up some signals about what's happening in an economy.
Two things. First being, what are some of the common misunderstood aspects of public budgeting? We're getting into the budget season, so there's a lot of conversation about the budget and what's coming up and where monies are going. And there are all these expectations of people, whether they're in government or without or outside of government. They're looking for particular programs, they're looking for things, they're looking for increases. All of these things people are looking for. But what are some of the common misconceptions and things that people misunderstand about public budgeting?
I think people basically misunderstand how government raises money and how they spend money. Right?
I think it's a miracle tree somewhere that they just pull.
No,
I believe that people
I also believe that the average person thinks that the government has infinite resources.
Yes,
right. So
I agree with you there.
That's a big one. The government does not have. The government only has resources to the extent that they can collect revenue. And where do they get revenue in the Bahamas? VAT, import duties, stamp duties, all of those things, fees, all the things you pay to get a government service. All of that goes to the consolidated fund, in other words, the government's account, and they can only spend to the extent that they have revenues collected. Now, we know that some countries spend more than they have revenues collected, and that's the problem of debt. But in a sense, you want to make sure that whatever I'm taking in as revenue, I'm spending, or they're closely in balance. Now, you want to build a new airport, you want to build a new hospital, that's infrastructure works, capital expenditure. You expect governments to borrow to do those things, because it's like when you build a house, you're not going to take your salary every month and pay for the house being built unless it's a mortgage, right? You've already contracted the mortgage and you're paying for that over time. The same with the way government spends on infrastructure. So new airport, new road, new schools, that's the capital budget. What's interesting to note, to your question, when you're analyzing where the government is spending, in my opinion, for a country like ours, which has a lot of development needs, you want to see the capital expenditure, so all the expenditure on infrastructure, you want to see that as a percentage rising. Why? Because investment, public investment, if done properly, and if we get good value for money, so this is important, back to what you were discussing in the earlier segment with Matt, you want to make sure that those expenditures, and if we building a hotel or not building a hotel, because let's leave that to the private sector, but building a hospital or building a new school, that the way it's built, we're going to get value for money. So we don't want the school deteriorating in 6 months or in a year, or the hospital breaking down in 5 years even.
That's a whole other show, a whole other discussion. But you're right, yeah.
That's where the capital expenditure, looking at that number and how countries manage their capital expenditure is always a good indicator of where this country is headed. Is it investing in new infrastructure, in new programs, digital transformation, for example? Is it doing innovative things that are going to make the country look more competitive to investors on the outside? Is it better for domestic investors, right? So those investments must make sense to investors. So where we put money into new airports or new hospitals or new schools should be a signal for where the government thinks it's headed and what the future prospects are going to be based on those investments. So that you want to look for that. You want to look for capital expenditure growing. You also want to look for, let's say I live in Inagua, right? Do I see any new school, new hospital, new roads being built in Inagua? I want to look at all of those individual sectoral lines in the budget, and the way the Bahamas government does it, you can see by ministry, but you can also take a look at the sectors where the money is being spent to say, where is the money being spent and why is it being spent there? But these are questions you ask yourself, because it doesn't always come out in the budget presentation. But I would say, when you listen to the budget presentation, you listen to the minister delivering the budget or the prime minister, whoever delivers the budget, you want to listen for any new expenditures in things that I care about. For example, I care about the environment, I care about parks, I care about good roads, I care about having decent schools for our children. Do we have any new investments in STEM education? What are we doing to make sure that Bahamian children are equipped for working in this new world we're living in? Everybody's talking about artificial intelligence. Well, if our children aren't exposed to using ChatGPT, and I know a lot of them are because they're doing their homework using this. So making sure that they are prepared to be really skilled workers, because it's getting more and more complicated to be a global worker that's competitive.
All of this to me comes back really to being financially literate and having that financial literacy. And why is it so important for us to be literate, to understand what it is we're looking for, to be able to ask the right questions, to be able to question our leaders when we see a national budget, to say, wait a minute, why is it that our capital investment has only grown by 5% when it should be 10 or 15 or 20? And so why is it, and are people really getting the tools they need to be financially literate?
Right, so it's important on many levels. It's important nationally because the more financially literate your citizens are, the more they tend to be engaged in civic activities. So the more I care about whether I throw garbage out of my car as I'm driving along. Do I care about my neighborhood? Am I joining in my neighbors to keep my neighborhood clean, right? So that's one level. The other level, of course, is being holding our public officials to account. So at the beginning of every administration, usually there is some statement of, these are the things I'd like to get done in 5 years'
Like
time.
priorities.
These are our priorities. And these are the priorities, by the way, that Bahamians say they're interested in. We're concerned about sustainability. We're concerned about low energy costs. We're concerned about renewable energy, which is, we're seeing a lot of that recently in the press. We're concerned about our environment all the time. We're concerned about crime and violence, right? Safety issues. So I want to know how my concerns are translated into how the government's spending its money, right? And it's sort of like, we can break it down, it's like a household. So at home, that same $100 that I have to spend, how do I spend it? I've got to pay electricity bill, I've got to pay the water bill, I've got to pay whatever, all those things have to come out of those resources. And as the person managing that budget, you have to think ahead, okay? Something might happen. I need to also save some of that $100 because you know what? Someone's going to get sick. Someone's going to
Plumbing's going to break down.
Right?
The car's going to break down.
Exactly. Something needs fixing. And governments are basically the same. What I think, and I've noticed this across this region especially, what governments don't do well in their budgets, and going back to the capital expenditure, we do not appropriate enough resources for maintenance. Right? You see this all the time.
All the time.
Brand new building.
5-10 years? Yep.
Doors are breaking down in the bathroom, da 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 da. And I can almost write like a whole thesis on this, but for some reason, we don't allocate sufficient resources into maintenance. So, operation maintenance, that line, you ought to be seeing that line also, especially if the capital budget is increasing, you want to see that line also increasing. Because it means that, all right, I built a new hospital, I got a provision for the things breaking down, and I need to fix those things. Because it's always more expensive to then go and build a new hospital in 20 years' time because we didn't keep the maintenance going on the original one. So there are things like that. Other things to look for. Me being someone who's very concerned about fiscal matters, I want to look at what's happening with wages and salaries. Because there are two items in the budget document that are always rigid. Wages and salaries, and when I say rigid, I mean there's not a lot of flexibility. Wages and salaries and interest payments. We have to always pay our debt. If we don't pay our debts, we know what happens. In the case of when you buy a car and you stop paying on the car, they come and recover the car. In the case of a country, you stop paying your debts, you're downgraded with your credit rating, nobody else is going to lend to you, you run into problems very fast trying to access credit. That's not a good situation to be in. When that happens, there's a crisis, maybe you run off to the IMF and I need help, right? We don't want that to happen. But on wages and salaries, why it's important to monitor this. The rule of thumb, as a share of GDP, it should be well below 10%, right, of GDP. IMF would say you don't want it to be more than 9% of GDP. You don't want it growing because unless you can improve the efficiency of your workers over time, you're building up future liabilities. And what I mean by future liabilities is, because when I hire you, I've got a provision now for your pension, for your health care, and all those things. So when you see that number growing very fast, it's always, it sends a red flag to people who monitor these things because it says, all right, hold on. If you keep doing that, you can build a new hospital and a new school. Because wages and salaries are recurrent expenditures, meaning every month you got to pay those. And if that gets out of hand quickly, you're going to end up with a problem. And we know that sometimes the human resources in the public service, and I'm going to put this the best way I can.
Sure. I know exactly what you're about to say, but go ahead.
Not the most efficient and not the most productive, right? And we've all had that experience. You've gone into offices and there are a ton of people around working, but you can't figure out what are they doing or what's the productivity that's accruing from all these people.
And it ties back, I think, to the earlier statement that people think that the government
has infinite resources.
Infinite resources.
And if I want a job, the first place I might look is the government. But that's not what the government's there to do. The government's really there to deliver on important services, education, health, security, management.
Listen, this has been such an amazing conversation. We're just about out of time. But as we are entering this budget period and budget cycle, it's going, it's the thing that's dominating the news. We're going to be talking about it for the next few weeks. What kinds of things should ordinary Bahamians be looking for and questioning and asking their MPs about in this current budget? What are the red flags? What are the signs of progress? What are the things that I need to be paying attention to as a Bahamian as I'm now keeping my government accountable?
Before I answer, let me just put in a plug for the program that
Yes.
ORG has called Be Clear.
Yes.
We've been running these educational programs on financial and fiscal literacy. There's a lot on the website, so go to the ORG website. You can also request from us an information session if you want, for your group, for your church, for your community. That's available. We'll provide the resources to do that. So please check that out. To answer your specific question, what should we be looking for? The things I mentioned already. The debt. Is it going down or is it going up? If it's going up, why is it going up? Is it foreign debt? Is it domestic debt? Because if it's a lot of it is domestic debt, that's putting pressure on credit markets locally. So you may want a mortgage, but you know what? CIBC doesn't have any more resources because the government has gobbled up all the borrowing power. That you want to look out for that. You want to look out for wages and salaries growing too fast. You want to look out for the revenues. Are there any increases in taxes being announced in the budget? So typically when countries start to have issues with, can I balance this budget? One of the best ways to do that is, okay, let's raise taxes. So VAT now, which is, I keep forgetting what it is, 10% or whatever it is, could be up to something. I'm not saying that that's what they're thinking about, but we only have a few levers because the Bahamas, as you know, is a very low tax regime. Our tax to GDP ratio is barely 20%, which is way too low. For a country like ours, it should probably be something like 25% of GDP. It's not that. So there's always room for increasing taxes. No taxpayer likes to hear that, but you'd rather help to pay off for the spending that the government's doing. And by the way, the spending, you want to make sure that spending makes sense, right? So you want our airports to be built in places where you know it's going to attract the most visitors or the most traffic, or we need to improve safety of some airports. So it's important. And that's where watchdogs like ORG, that's where audit institutions come in to say, all right, we're really getting value for money because we've done those good things. I think the Bahamas, if I were to grade it lately, we've been doing better on transparency, sharing more information. One thing I would suggest to the government, do a people's budget. Very simple analysis, even using cartoons or something animated to explain to people, because not everybody is like you and me, right?
Sure.
And that will help to improve literacy, but also to just help everybody in the country can identify with what the government's doing and why it's doing it. And that's really important for citizenship, for ownership of the ideas, so we can rally around whatever the big idea is. Every Bahamian wants to rally around it, right?
Therese, I just want to thank you for a great discussion.
Thank you.
Certainly have helped to bring a lot of understanding to the process. I think people watching this will be able to appreciate, what they're looking for in the budget, what they are holding their leaders accountable for.
Absolutely.
What are the red flags? What are the signs of progress? These things are very, very important, and often we miss them in the conversation. So thank you. Keep up the good work. I just want to put in a plug. We're going to have you back.
Okay.
We have lots to talk about. All right.
Thank
you again. And sir, welcome, your first time to On the Record. I hope it's been a good time. We definitely want you to come back and share with us.
Thank you.
All right. So whether it's writing a letter for transparency, exploring data on a digital map, or understanding how government dollars are spent, ORG reminds us that governance is not a spectator sport. It's something we all practice and participate in every day. A huge thank you to Matt Aubry, Therese Turner-Jones for joining us here tonight, and to you, our viewers, for staying engaged. Visit orgbahamas.com to learn more, get involved, and be a part of shaping the future of the Bahamas. Until next time, I'm Jerome Sawyer. This has been On the Record. We'll see you next week.